This is an illegal labour market in northeastern China. The government says it doesn't exist. The signs on their shirts say carpenter for hire, labourer, plumber. Every day, thousands of desperate people flood in, hoping for some of the few jobs that do exist.
China's 20-year flirtation with capitalism has provided the rich world with cheap toys and clothes, but it's left millions of ordinary Chinese people utterly destitute.
As the world's most populous country joins the World Trade Organization, I've come to find out what life is like for 350 million Chinese who live on the edge. I'm 50 meters under the Huangpu River in the heart of Shanghai, city of the future.
So what is it? Hell or paradise?
This is the glitzy new 21st century China the government wants the world to see.
Well, thank you. That was a rather unusual view of Shanghai.
I emerge into a future of another sort. Until 20 years ago, there were rice fields where these skyscrapers stand. My government minder says Shanghai is sprouting 500 new glass and steel towers every year.
So this is just one of the little local neighborhood trading posts. And in places like this, people just wander in and stir-fry their stocks and shares, as it's said.
Capitalism has taken communist China by storm.
The market's right on the floor at the moment, yeah?
Now China's crossing the final frontier, membership of the World Trade Organization. But away from Shanghai, there's another China paying the price for this race to join the mainstream global economy. I flew to Beijing to catch the train north and see this other China for myself.
Okay, so we're in the central station in Beijing and we're about to jump on a train to the northeastern city of Shenyang. It's the capital of our big province up there called Liaoning. You've got to keep moving, sorry.
Time-wise, we're cutting it fine. Our porter's a migrant from a faraway rural province. Millions like him have swarmed into big cities only to scrape by in the twilight economy. The problem is getting to talk to them.
Does nobody talk on Chinese trains or something?
It's pretty quiet. Why is nobody talking?
Everybody's watching. Weird foreigners.
Our minder has been challenged about whether or not we're allowed to film at all, and she has to bring out all her papers from the Foreign Ministry and China Central Television, for whom she works, and try to persuade them to allow us to film. Put the camera down a sec.
The guard eventually does back down, but on condition we film no one but me.
This city, Shenyang, which we're travelling to, is up in the far northeast of China. There's Beijing, the capital. There's Shenyang, and that's this 9-hour train journey. Shenyang used to be the industrial heartland of China, but those industries have been going bankrupt at such a rate that it's now better known as the Rust Belt.
In Shenyang, there's a giant statue of Mao Zedong, beckoning workers towards the city's industrial smokestacks. But now the competitive pressures of the market economy have driven many inefficient factories out of business. Workers have been laid off in droves. This is the story I wanted to get to. Meet Mrs. Yuan, news director of the Foreign Ministry in Shenyang. Her job, to decide what we'll actually have in our film. She's drawn up a formidable schedule.
I'd just like her to understand that there are certain things that we have to film, which make her schedule makes difficult.
Mrs. Yuan's most important engagement of the day lunch with a local mayor. Plenty of alcohol, fantastic food, and a fish carved out of melon.
The pronounce it fish.
Yes.
So you have.
Yes. Could I have some water, please?
The Chinese government spends £8 billion a year on official banquets. Now I know how. I'd hoped the after effects of the wine might give us a chance to film a bankrupt state-owned chemical plant we happened to pass.
Well, why don't we just ask and see if they could allow us to film inside?
State-owned factories like this one used to look after their workers from cradle to grave.
Ni hao.
No longer.
Can I go in to take a look? No. Is this one dead? Finished? The boss is upstairs. Let's go and get Sophie and Mrs. Yuan. Ah, here they come.
This is the story they're anxious to hide. You can understand why.
We have to get permission. But the trouble is, Mrs. Yuan, you know, we've respected your schedule totally, and sometimes when you just see something at the side of the road that it's nice to film, we just like to be able to do that. It can take such a long time to get permission.
Bankrupt factories can't pay redundancy money to workers. Those who've retired lose their pensions. Everything goes: schools, housing, even free haircuts. Later, we hired our own van and got a little closer to reality.
Okay, we're just about to meet the lady who's just thrown the bag in the dustbin there. She's called Mrs. Wang, and she lives in this very poor neighborhood. And she's going to give us a tour of some of the rundown factories in this area.
She's taking a big risk meeting us, let alone being filmed. But she says things can't get any worse.
要是星期天吧，出来干还可以，平时吧赶上星期一或者平时就往外撵，根本就不让出。
Like most of her family, Mrs. Wang's been laid off. Mrs. Wang has just been giving us a little tour around the area in which she lives. It's a very poor, rundown, post-industrial suburb of Shenyang called Tuixi. And in this area, people are desperately poor, she says. There's hardly anybody in work anymore. And in fact, she says there's a sort of a village within a village up here where just yesterday a family of 3 committed suicide by jumping off the roof of a building. Locals call this the Avenue of Losses. The chimneys don't belch out their poisonous smoke anymore. That's the good news. The bad news is that the province has shed more than 5 million workers in a decade.
Metal factory.
沈阳锅炉总厂。
So that's Mrs. Wang's old factory in there. She's just been showing us a really classic case of what happens when a state-owned enterprise gets its assets stripped. Her former boss sold off the land, and there's some flats you can see just in here. Those were all built on land that were sold off by the boss, and he made about £1 million yuan out of it, which is more than £100,000.
What makes Mrs. Wang most angry is that this was state-owned land. The boss, she said, had taken a fee for the deal he'd brokered with corrupt local officials. Later that night, we went to see Mrs. Wang at her home. She supports her family by packing chopsticks for restaurants. All she has to show for years of hard work, a few meaningless pieces of paper.
This is about £10,000 worth of not only Mrs. Wang's life savings, but her husband's entire life savings, her sister's entire life savings, her mother's and father's life savings, and she put it into this finance company which offer high interest rates. It was backed by corrupt officials in the municipal government, and it went bust, leaving hundreds and hundreds of people like her with absolutely nothing. She just lost everything overnight.
Then Mrs. Wang told me her story.
I just get the sense that, you know, this This lady was so hopeful. She had so much to live for, and it's just gone horribly wrong. Her factory, she worked 21 years for her factory, and now she's just left destitute. And she's watched other people in China get richer, but there must be millions, maybe tens of millions of people like her.
In China's cradle-to-grave system, state companies not only guaranteed workers an income for life, but free healthcare too. Now, when they're sacked or their companies go bust, there's no one to pick up the bill. I'd asked to see a cancer hospital because cancer rates here are 3 times the national average. Doctors say it's caused by industrial pollution. This is a cancer ward. The treatment here is world-class.
Could you ask him how he manages to pay for the treatment he's getting here?
就是也是你的单位给你的付款吗？
对，我单位有保险。
My factory pays, he told me. If they didn't, I wouldn't be here. So what happens, I wondered, if you lose your job, then get sick? I wanted to find out. We hired our own car again and headed for the rougher side of town.
Can I just ask Mr. Tianfeng what it is, the illness that he has?
他这能跟他讲一下你得的是什么病吗？他得的是什么病？
我是肺癌。
Lung cancer.
长个瘤，癌症。
He should be in hospital, Tianfeng. He's got lung cancer. He could get treatment. In days gone by, the factory for whom he worked would have given him that treatment, but these days he can't afford it. He's been out of work now for 4 or 5 years, and his wife too has been laid off. There isn't any hope for him at all, really. It's hard to know what to say.
The operation to remove the cancerous growth on his lung costs £3,000, 4 years' wages, even if he had a job. Back on the official tour, I'm at a showcase government retraining centre for the unemployed. My guide, Provincial Vice Governor Liu Kegu.
Still so hot, I don't know.
That's a plum blossom.
Could I ask, I know it's difficult in these circumstances, but I'd love to get a sense of whether they do feel hopeful that the retraining will allow them to work again in the future.
我可以问他吗？
可以啊，
就是他想就问他，觉得可能这么多人不好意思，他就说反正能尽量能讲，就是说。
She says she's hopeful. Maybe I can sell noodles or something, she says. I get a whirlwind tour. Everything from toy making to computers to massage. But the numbers going through here are a drop in the ocean. Across China, 30 million more state workers are forecast to lose their jobs in the next 5 years.
Vice
Governor Liu believes they found a solution. A pioneering new project to replace the failed factory welfare schemes with a social safety net properly funded by the state.
Mr. Liu, as the Vice Governor, has got responsibility for turning round in this province what is basically a post-industrial nightmare, and he's been very refreshingly open and honest about some of the problems that he's facing. He's obviously hoping that with this new social security system and all these new insurance policies that he's hoping to bring in, that he can keep the lid on social discontent here before it boils over.
We slipped off for a lunch break on our own and witnessed something we weren't meant to see.
And one of our contacts has told us that here outside the city government offices, you get regular demonstrations of sometimes thousands of demonstrators, people who've lost everything. They're here. Just give us the camera. This is a country where you're not allowed to demonstrate.
They're desperate to keep the plight of these people unreported. We drive round the block and look for a spot to park for a minute.
I would say there's about 150, 200 demonstrators at the building there. We can see 5 or 6 policemen, including one in full uniform who's got a beta camera filming the protesters.
With nearly 300 protests a day across China, the government's scared mounting social unrest may become an unstoppable force. That afternoon, I was passed a remarkable piece of film. This is what the government does to people who organize protests. The prisoner is a 70-year-old man from Shenyang who dared to stand up for workers, pensioners and victims of official corruption. He was sent to a labor camp for 2 years, where this film was secretly taken. His name is Zhou Wei. I learned he'd just been released, and I wanted to meet him. But that night, we got some disturbing news.
I've just sent a text message to our production base in the UK, letting them know that we've been followed and warned not to do any further filming on our own, which is a real problem.
Zhou Wei has agreed to meet us. Despite the warning, we've decided to take the risk. Very early the next morning, we slip out while our minders sleep.
So far so good?
Our plan, to quickly switch vehicles in case we're being followed again. We're waiting in the lobby of a nearby hotel for the signal.
Okay, that's it. Perfect. We've got our tinted window van. That seemed to work very well. And the trouble is, with all this cloak and dagger stuff, changing cars and that sort of thing, we just don't know whether it's necessary to be as paranoid as this, but we're told that generally paranoia pays. Certainly it does for someone like Zhou Wei, the man we're going to go and see.
On the way to our rendezvous, we take a slight detour.
We're on Dragon Mountain, which is where the labour camp is, where Zhou Wei spent 2 years. Okay, really nice and slowly. That's the camp. There's the front gate on the left. There's about 300 inmates in there.
Most are sent here without trial, as Zhou Wei was. In a village outside Shenyang, Zhou Wei was waiting for us at what he called a safe house. He showed me treasured documents which had survived police raids on his home. He's a revolutionary veteran of Mao's Red Army.
This is his certificate to say that he was a model worker. We're concerned very much for your safety. Are you happy to appear on this program?
Zhou Wei said yes, but warned that he's still under close surveillance. Yet he said, "I'm not afraid to speak because I'm telling the truth." He told me how market reforms had made some factory bosses and local party officials greedy and corrupt. He said that because of him, several prominent officials are on trial. Despite this, his wife and daughter have been repeatedly threatened, and he remains unforgiven. The authorities, he said, won't tolerate independent whistleblowers.
Well, Zhou Wei certainly makes for the strangest of Chinese dissidents. For the past hour he's been talking to me in glowing terms about his love for the Communist Party, even though he's lost his membership of that party. But on one thing, Zhou Wei is absolutely adamant. That is his determination, despite spending 2 years in a labour camp, to carry on fighting against corruption, which he says is still endemic in this city, and is causing great misery among ordinary people.
Most ordinary people in China, however, live and work in the countryside. I wanted to get out and see it for myself. Joining the World Trade Organization may spell disaster for peasant farmers who will find it impossible to compete with cheap imports like rice from America. But if the authorities were sensitive about what we saw in the city, out here they seemed even more worried. And with Mrs. Yuan in command and a cortege of Agriculture Ministry saloons as an escort, I wasn't hopeful of getting to the real story.
Mrs. Wang, here we are. I feel rather ill after that journey. We've travelled for 3 hours to reach this spot. God knows why.
As I followed my hosts, it dawned on me. This was a model village. I was to be herded from one dwelling to another for specially arranged interviews with model peasants.
I think we're being followed by the convoy. All right. Ni hao.
I struck out on my own to try to conduct an impromptu interview. Suddenly there weren't any people. But this woman looked like she might have something interesting to say. She told me again and again that the Communist Party was fantastic. Fair enough, though. They've given her this new house. But I wasn't quite sure whether she was addressing me or the local party secretary lurking beside us. Over the past 3 years, protests by peasants throughout rural China have been widespread and occasionally violent. The government knows the extent of the problem, but I was herded out of this village without any sense of what people here really thought. That night, back in Shenyang, I began to understand more. My taxi driver drove me down dark streets lined with prostitutes, many from the countryside. He said around 150 had been murdered over the past 5 or 6 years, often killed by unemployed men with no money to pay. Mao's China eradicated prostitution, but the free markets changed all that. It's now among the few job opportunities available to millions of migrant women. Shenyang is the regional sleaze capital.
This is Li. Li comes from Liaoning province. She's a daughter in another city not very far away, who she rings every week. She's done a variety of different jobs, including very heavy labour and construction.
Li's problems started when the paper mill she worked for went under. Then her husband, a fisherman, died. Now she lives off 1 meal a day and shares a room with 5 other prostitutes, also from the countryside. She says she despises what she does. It's only so her 12-year-old daughter can have the chance of a better life, she says. If it weren't for that, Li says she'd have killed herself long ago. Li's smiling eyes were a mask. I wondered just how long she could endure. And when you think of the millions out there just like her, you get a sense of a volcano ready to blow. Maybe one day they will reap the benefits of China's entry into the mainstream global economy. Until then, the government faces the prospect of ever larger numbers of people questioning the price of admission.